The albino came in on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days the feed delivery was late, and I was always in a bad mood by the time the crates cleared the bay ramp. The usual scramble, checking inventory against what actually showed up, signing off on manifests that never quite matched, hauling the heavier sacks to the back store myself because my one assistant, a young man named Porus, had a bad shoulder that particular week. Tuesdays were administrative in the worst way, and I did not want a new intake on a Tuesday. The clutch transport landed without warning. That happened sometimes. Out on the Cordafel fringe, you did not always get advance notice of what was coming in. The station I ran, Vale Station, though most just called it Sella's Place, which I never encouraged, had been operating as a veterinary rescue and rehabilitation outpost for 11 years. We took in injured animals, sick animals, animals that had been displaced by the various territorial upheavals that swept through the outer settlements every few years. We took in a fair number of dragons, too, because most of the larger veterinary facilities, closer to the core, did not want the liability, and most of the fringe settlements did not have the equipment. So they sent things to me. I am not a romantic about it. I trained as a veterinary specialist. 11 years of study, another 8 of field work before I applied for the outpost grant. I know how to read a blood panel, and I know how to set a splint, and I know how to make the judgment, sometimes, that the kindest thing is to sit quietly with an animal in its last hours, rather than subject it to another round of treatments that will not help. That is the work. There is nothing heroic about it. It is a job that requires patience and a strong stomach and a willingness to be wrong. The transport that landed that Tuesday was operated by a clutch relocation contractor named Heth Daver. I had dealt with him before, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression who always seemed to be apologizing for something. He came off the ramp with his cap in his hands, and his eyes on the ground, which told me immediately that the intake was going to be complicated. "Doctor, Moth," he said. "What did you bring me, Davar?" "There was a clutch," he said. 7 hatchlings. Verith Voral descent, though not a documented line, just a hill pair that nested out past the Keth ridgeline. The pair was killed in a rock slide. The clutch wardens found them too late. 3 of the hatchlings didn't survive the cold. 3 are going to the recovery facility at Toral Station. They're in decent shape. The 7th. He stopped. "The 7th, I said. "I'd like you to look at it before I explain further," he said, and that was how I knew it was very bad. The 7th hatchling was in a temperature-controlled carry case, and when Davar lifted the lid, I understood his tone. She was albino. Not the pale cream that some of the Western bloodlines ran to, but true albino, white scales with just the faintest trace of iridescence, pink-edged where the scale borders showed the skin beneath, eyes that were dark at the center, and ringed with pale iris coloring that would make bright light difficult for her entire life. She was small. For a Varath Voral hatchling, she was extremely small, perhaps half the expected size for her age, which does Field's notes placed at roughly 3 weeks post-shell. Her wings were folded against her sides, and even at rest I could see the left wing sat at a slightly wrong angle, not break but a ligament problem, the kind that came from early nutritional deficit. She was trembling in the case, not from cold, the temperature was appropriate, but from the low-grade distress that hatchlings in her condition carried like a second skin. The clutch rejected her, Davar said. The wardens noted it in the field. The other 3, the healthy ones going to Toral, they were actively pushing her out. It's the albino presentation, likely. In wild pairs out past the ridgeline, a hatchling that looks like this gets treated as compromised. The pair would have managed it differently, but they were gone before the clutch dynamic established. I was already running my hands along her sides, very gently, reading the rib structure and the wing joints. She tolerated it. She was too exhausted to object. "What does Toral say?" I asked. "Toral says they don't have the isolation capacity for a rejection case. The other 3 would set on her again. They said," he paused, "they said if she doesn't go somewhere suitable, they'd recommend euthanasia. They were very apologetic about it." "I'm sure they were," I said. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me with those pale-ringed eyes, and she was not asking for anything. She did not have the language for it yet. She was just a small creature in a case, cold at the edges and unsteady, and the world had not been particularly interested in her so far. "Leave her with me," I said. "Dr. Moth, the grant terms for the outpost don't technically cover. Leave her with me, Davar." He left her with me. That was the beginning of it. I named her Vel for administrative purposes, just a short handle for the intake records, the kind of placeholder name you give an animal when you don't know yet what it will become. In practice, I used her name rarely. She was simply the albino, or sometimes just the small one, and those were not unkind terms. They were accurate. She was small and she was albino, and for the first several months, those two facts defined almost everything about her care. The wing ligament was the first priority. I splinted it with a soft form brace, the kind we used for juvenile wing injuries in the medium weight species, and I adjusted it twice in the first week as her size changed. She did not like the brace, but she accepted it with the particular stoicism that I had come to associate with hatchlings who had learned early that comfort was not something they could negotiate for. She ate. That was the most important thing. She ate consistently and without drama, and when her weight began to climb toward the lower edge of the normal range for her age, I allowed myself a small internal acknowledgement that the intervention was working. The feeding routine in those early months was a thing I want to describe accurately because it is easy to make it sound warmer than it was in practice, and the practice had its own kind of worth that does not need decoration. I fed her 4 times a day, the high-protein soft feed formulated for juvenile dragons below the standard weight threshold. The portions were calibrated precisely. Too much, and the digestive system of an underweight hatchling would struggle. Too little, and the growth curve she needed would not establish. I kept a log for every feeding. Time, quantity offered, quantity consumed, behavioral notes. She finished most of what I offered her from the first week, which was a good sign and not a small thing. Animals in severe distress sometimes stop eating, and when they do, you are in a different kind of fight. She ate. I recorded it, adjusted quantities as she grew, and moved on to the next task. She did not thrive the way healthy hatchlings thrive. Healthy hatchlings are exuberant things. They stumble and crash and vocalize at inconvenient hours and eat more than you expect and generally make themselves felt in a way that you could track from 3 rooms away. Vel was not like that. She grew, and she ate, and she moved carefully around her enclosure, as though she was always calculating the distance to the nearest wall, the height of the nearest perch, the safest path between 2 points. It was not timidity exactly. It was more like the behavior of an animal that had learned, very early, that it could not afford to be surprised. There was a period, roughly her 2nd through 4th month with me, when I was genuinely unsure about the wing. The brace was doing its work, but the underlying tissue was not responding as quickly as I wanted it to, and there was a 2-week stretch where every assessment showed the same number. And I began to consider whether I had reached the ceiling of what the brace approach could accomplish. I consulted the specialist literature. I corresponded with a colleague at a facility on Vorath Station who had more experience with juvenile wing injuries in heavy descended species. She confirmed that I was reading the ligament correctly and gave me a modified protocol, a different brace angle, and a set of passive extension exercises that I was to run twice daily, gently, moving the wing through its range without forcing it. I ran those exercises every day for 6 weeks. Vel disliked them, which she expressed by going very still and directing a long, flat gaze at the wall across from me. She did not vocalize during them, which I appreciated. She just waited them out, and when I set her wing back and gave her the small food reward that I used to mark the end of the session, she took it, with the same composure she brought to everything. Then the ligament began to move. Not dramatically, a millimeter or 2 in the measured range, then another over the following weeks. Not enough, in the end, to fully close the deficit. The wing would carry a permanent limitation, but enough to work with, enough to fly. I found myself checking on her more than was strictly necessary. That is a hazard of this work. You develop what my old training supervisor called inappropriate investment, which is a clinical way of saying that you start caring about a specific animal more than the work requires. I had managed it before, had pulled back from it when I recognized the signs. With Vel, I did not pull back, and I was honest enough with myself to admit that I was not pulling back on purpose. She was good company. I know that sounds like a foolish thing to say about a hatchling dragon who could not yet fly and did not have enough language to do more than signal basic needs, but it was true. She was present in the way that some animals are, attentive to the room without demanding anything from it. On the evenings when I stayed late finishing records or waiting on a difficult case in the recovery ward, she would sometimes make her way to the edge of her enclosure and simply sit there watching. Not asking, just watching. I found that I talked to her the way you talk to a presence in a room when you have been alone too long. Not the elevated, slightly performative speech that people sometimes use with animals. Just talking. About the cases. About the supply shortfall. about the weather that was pressing down from the northwest and was going to make the landing approach dangerous for the next few days. She listened. That may sound like the projection of a woman who spent too many evenings alone in a veterinary outpost, and perhaps it was. But I have worked with animals for decades, and there is a quality of attention that is different from a sleeping animal or a distracted one. Vel had that quality. She listened. There was a night, perhaps 4 months in, when we had a difficult case in the recovery ward. An elderly Verith female who had been brought in with a spinal injury that I had known from the first assessment was almost certainly beyond repair. I had kept her comfortable, and I had run the tests because that was what you did, but the results came back the way I had expected them to. I sat with her until it was over. It was late when I came out of the ward, and I was tired in the way that specific losses tire you, a different weight than the ordinary fatigue of the work. Vel was at the edge of her enclosure. She had been in her sleeping position when I had passed through earlier, curled on the heated pad with her eyes closed. But she was awake now and sitting, and when I came in, she looked at me with that steady attention she had. I sat on the floor against the enclosure wall, which was not my usual behavior, and for a while I did not say anything and she did not demand anything. The station was quiet around us. Eventually, I said, "We lost the old girl in Bay 3. Vel made a low sound. Not language. She was not yet at the stage where draconic language was accessible to her, but a sound with weight in it, a resonance, and she moved to the nearest point of the enclosure and sat there and continued to look at me. We sat there for a while. That was all. Then I got up and finished locking the station and went to bed, and in the morning the work resumed, and that was how it went. The wing healed over the course of several months, not completely. There was always going to be a slight limitation on her left side extension, the ligament repair leaving a residual stiffness that would not respond further to treatment. But well enough that by the end of her first year with me, she could fly. Short distances at first, the width of the exercise yard, then longer passes over the outpost grounds, and finally, one clear morning in the second spring, she went up high enough that I lost her against the white sky for nearly 20 minutes and stood in the yard, with my hand shading my eyes until she came back down. She always came back. I did not examine that fact too closely. It was simply what she did. She went out and she came back, and I cataloged it in the records as normal behavioral development for a year-plus juvenile of her species, and I scheduled her quarterly assessments, and life at Vale Station continued in the way that life at Vale Station generally continued. Steady, useful, repetitive, and occasionally illuminated by moments that made the repetition worth enduring. The second year with her was quieter than the first. The acute phase of her care was behind us. She was not fully independent. She was young enough that the question of permanent release had not yet come up, and given her wing limitation and her albino presentation, I was not certain that release was the right outcome for her in any case. A dragon with a limited left wing extension and coloring that made her visible from a considerable distance had a harder time in the wild than a typical juvenile of her line. I thought about it. I had not yet made a decision, and Vel had not seemed to be pressing for one. She was larger now. A year and change of steady growth had brought her to a size that was still below the median for her cohort, but no longer alarmingly so. Her scales had settled into their adult pattern, the albino white deepening slightly toward an iridescent silver at the wing edges. The pale eye ring still present, but the dark center of her eyes now large and steady, reading. You could see the structure of what she was going to become. She was going to be striking, not despite the albino presentation, but because of it. The white of her was not the colorlessness of something washed out, but the particular brightness of something that had not been diluted, something that carried its own light. I told Porus this once, on an afternoon when we were both watching her cross the exercise yard, and he looked at me with the expression he sometimes wore where he was deciding whether to say something. "She's going to be a problem to release," he said. "I know. She's not going to blend. I know. The other thing is," he said, and stopped. "Say it. She doesn't act like she wants to go," he said. "The releases we've done, you can tell when they're ready. They start pressing at the perimeter. They stop making eye contact. She does the opposite." I said nothing to that, because he was right, and I did not have a policy response to it. She continued to make eye contact. She continued to come back. And I continued to see her last thing before I locked station at night and first thing when I opened it in the morning, because she had taken to roosting on the low ridge above the main building, visible from the yard, visible from the upper windows, a small white shape against the sky that my eyes went to without instruction. In the second year, she began to develop language. Not quickly, draconic language development in juveniles is a slow process, dependent on exposure and on a maturity threshold that the species does not reach uniformly. What she had was the early register, the basic communicative vocabulary, needs, observations, simple conditional statements. She used it selectively, the way she did everything, and she directed it at me more than at Porus or at any of the other animals in the station. I am not sure whether that was preference or simply the consequence of the fact that I spent more time in direct proximity to her than anyone else. Probably both. She started asking questions, simple ones at first, about the other animals in the recovery ward, about where particular sounds were coming from, about the supply crates when they arrived. She had a particular interest in the administrative work, which I had not expected. She would sit near the terminal when I was working, and occasionally indicate a specific entry on the record screen, and when I explained what it was, a blood value, a weight measurement, a treatment log, she listened to the explanation with the focused attention I had come to recognize as her processing mode. I realized at some point that I had been conducting a rather thorough ongoing education in veterinary, record keeping with a dragon who was not yet fully grown, and who had arrived at my station as a rejected hatchling. The recognition was accompanied by a feeling that I found difficult to categorize precisely. It was not quite pride. It was more like the satisfaction you feel when something you have been watching carefully turns out to be as good as you suspected it might be. She was interested in the work. That was not what I had expected, and it was not something I had taught her. It was just what she was. I did not examine that either. I simply worked, and she watched, and occasionally she asked about something in the records, and I explained it. There was a period in the middle of the second year when the station had a run of difficult cases. 4 animals in the recovery ward simultaneously, 2 of them requiring round-the-clock monitoring. Porus handled the nights when I needed sleep, and I handled the days, and for about 3 weeks we were both operating on less rest than was ideal, and the administrative backlog piled up in a way that I found genuinely irritating. I do not like a backlog. The paperwork is not the interesting part of the work, but it is the part that makes the interesting part possible. And when it falls behind, the sense of things being slightly out of true accumulates, until I can feel it as a low-grade irritation that affects everything. Valsella noticed. I know how that sounds, and I am reporting it as accurately as I can. She noticed the shift in my behavior, the shorter answers to her questions, the reduced time I spent in her section of the station, the different quality of attention I brought to the daily checks. And she adjusted accordingly. She stopped initiating contact in the evenings, which she had been doing with increasing regularity. She waited until I came to her, rather than moving to the edge of her space when she heard me in the corridor. She was quieter generally, in the way that some animals are when they have read the room and decided that what is needed from them is less rather than more. One of the cases in the ward was a young Vathari breed, a semi-aquatic species that I had not treated before and had to research rapidly when it came in. The injury was a fin structure problem, analogous to a wing issue but more complex, because the fin structures in the Vathari were integrated with a respiratory assist system that I did not fully understand until I had spent several evenings in the reference literature. I got the treatment right eventually, but the weeks of research and trial monitoring had a cost, and by the end of the 3rd week I was sitting in the back office at a late hour, going through records and feeling the particular fatigue that came not from the physical demands of the work, but from the sustained uncertainty of managing a case where I was not operating from solid ground. Valsella came to the office doorway. She did not come in. She had learned early that the office was a space I used for concentration and that entering it uninvited was not the thing to do. She stood in the doorway and looked at me. "Go to your enclosure," I said. "It's late." She did not move. Vel. She made the low affirming resonance that I had come to understand as a particular kind of acknowledgement, not agreement. Exactly, but a signal that she had received what was said and was considering it. And then she sat down in the doorway, not in the office. In the doorway, which was technically not the space I had asked her to leave. She sat there and settled in with the quality of something that has decided to stay for a while. And she looked at me with those large, steady eyes, and she did not demand anything. I looked at her for a moment. "I'm not good company tonight," I said. The affirming resonance again. I turned back to the records. She stayed in the doorway. After a while, the quality of the room was different, in the way it was always different when she was present. Not warmer exactly, or louder, but less empty. I worked through the backlog. She stayed. At some point, I stopped being aware of her as a specific presence, and she became simply part of the room, the way a familiar sound become part of the background. When I finished and closed the terminal, I looked up. She was still there. That was several hours, I said. She looked at me without particular comment. You should sleep. She stood slowly and stretched in the way that large-jointed creatures stretch. The whole spine, the wing shoulders, the long neck, a comprehensive unfolding that ended with her standing at her full current height in the doorway. Then she turned and went down the corridor toward her enclosure. I sat in the chair for a moment in the empty office. Then I went to lock up and checked on the ward cases and went to bed. The backlog cleared over the following week as the acute cases stabilized. The Vathari breed recovered fully, which I was professionally pleased about. The other 3 cases resolved without significant incident. The administrative work came current. The sense of things being slightly out of true went away, and the station returned to its ordinary rhythms. Velsela resumed her usual patterns. The questions about the records, the evenings near the enclosure edge when I was working late, the mornings on the ridge. Things went back to what they were. I did not remark on it, and neither did she, because that was not the kind of relationship we had. It was not built on remark. It was built on presence, which was a different thing and, I thought, a more durable one. I want to say one more thing about the second year before the delegation arrived, because I think it is relevant to understanding what the year was. There was an afternoon in the late autumn when I went out to the exercise yard to check the perimeter fencing, routine maintenance, the kind of thing I did on a monthly schedule, and I found Velsela already in the yard, in the far corner, doing something I had not seen her do before. She was moving in a deliberate pattern across the yard's open space, not flying. The yard was not large enough for proper flight at her current size, but a ground movement pattern that had a structure to it. Forward and left, pause. Forward and right, pause. A specific sequence repeated with the kind of focus that I associated with an animal practicing something. I watched from the gate without interrupting. She ran the sequence 6 or 7 times, and it was not the same each time. There were small variations, adjustments, as though she was testing different versions of the same movement. Her left wing, the limited one, was held at a specific angle throughout, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. She was working out a compensation pattern for the limitation. How to move on the ground so that the left wing deficit affected her balance as little as possible. How to carry the asymmetry without letting it carry her. She had not asked for help with this. She had not flagged it as something she was thinking about. She had simply gone out to the yard and started working on it. I stood at the gate and watched her for a long time before I finished this check and went back inside. I wrote it in her record that evening. Behavioral note, voluntary proprioceptive compensation exercise, ground movement, yard, approximately 40 minutes. No intervention required. Assessment. She is problem-solving without prompting. Prognosis, positive. It was one of the better entries I had written in 11 years of records. In the early weeks of her 3rd year with me, the delegation arrived. I had no warning. That was the first thing that struck me. Not that they came, because unusual arrivals were part of the work, but that there was no transport communication, no manifest, no scheduled landing. One moment, the sky above the station was clear, and the next there were 12 of them in the upper air, and they were not a species I had treated, or even encountered in 11 years of outpost work. They were large. That was the most immediate fact. The largest dragon I had cared for at Vale Station was an elderly Varath bull who had been brought in after a territorial injury, and he had been impressive. Massive in the way of working animals that have spent decades doing heavy lifting. These 12 were larger, not in the bulk and muscle sense of the bull, but in the way of something that had been growing for a very long time and had not stopped. The scale coloring varied. Dark copper, weathered slate, deep amber, but they all shared a structural quality, a density of bone and scale that spoke of an extraordinary age, ancient dragons. I had read about them in the scholarly literature, the way you read about things that exist at a scale most practitioners will never encounter directly. They landed in the outer yard in a formation that was clearly deliberate, and they did not move from that formation. I came out of the main building because the station's pressure sensors had gone off, and I thought for a moment it was a weather event. It was not a weather event. It was 12 ancient dragons in my outer yard, arranged in 2 rows of 6, all of them facing the main gate, with a stillness that was not the stillness of animals resting, but the stillness of something held in suspension, waiting. I stood at the top of the building steps and looked at them, and they looked at me, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, the one at the front of the formation spoke. The language was formal, the old register of draconic communication, the kind I had some familiarity with from veterinary training, but not enough to catch every nuance. What I caught was this: a greeting, a formal identification. She gave her name, which was Vorath Kale, and a title I did not have a translation for, something that meant roughly senior keeper or eldest record. And then a question. She asked if the white one was here. I said, in the trade register draconic that I used for clinical communication. There is an albino hatchling in my care. She has been with me for approximately 2 years. The formation's stillness deepened, which I had not thought possible. It was the kind of stillness that happened when something long anticipated finally arrived. We would see her, Vorath Kale said. In the same formal register, I said carefully. She is not a captive. I will ask her. That produced something I had not expected. The 12 of them, all 12, lowered their heads. Not all the way. Not the full prostration I would later learn was their deepest form of respect, but a partial inclination, deliberate and slow. I went inside and found Porus standing at the window with his mouth open. Did you? He started. Yes, I said. Watch the station. Don't go out. I went to the back enclosure where Vel spent her late mornings on a flat-topped boulder that caught the sun at the right angle. She was there. She saw me come around the corner and she did the thing she always did. Lifted her head and fixed me with that large, steady gaze. There are people here to see you, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped off the boulder and walked with me to the front yard. What happened when she came around the corner of the building was something I have tried to describe several times in the years since, and have never quite managed to get right. The 12 ancients, who had been still as stone, moved. Not a dramatic movement. They did not lunge or cry out. They simply changed the way a room changes when something that has been missing from it is put back. They oriented toward her, every head, every pair of eyes, the full attention of 12 ancient dragons turning toward this once small white creature who crossed the yard with her head slightly tilted, curious and unhurried, and stopped a few meters from the formation's front edge. Vorath Kale spoke. The formal register dropped. What came out was not the vocabulary of ceremony, but something older and simpler and harder to translate. The words that a people use for something they believed they had lost. I caught fragments. The bloodline name, which was Vorath Sela, the founding name, the first name. The diaspora, a scattering I had no detailed knowledge of, some event in the deeper past that had sent a particular line across the outer fringe. A hatchling, the last breeding pair's hatchling, that had gone unrecorded in the chaos. Vel sat in the middle of this and listened to it with her head still slightly tilted, in the attitude that I recognized as her listening posture. Then she walked forward and put her head against Vorath Kale's jaw. It was the gesture she used with me when she wanted to be acknowledged. I had never seen her use it with another dragon. Vorath Kale went very still. Then slowly, she lowered her head fully, the complete prostration, the deepest register. And the 11 behind her did the same. 12 ancient dragons bowing their heads to the ground in the outer yard of a veterinary rescue station on the Corda Fell fringe. And in the middle of it, Vel stood and let it happen with the calm of something that has been exactly where it is supposed to be. I stood at the corner of the building and watched, and I am not given to easy emotion, but I will admit that I had to press my hand against the wall for a moment. Porus appeared at my elbow. What is happening? He said quietly. I don't entirely know yet, I said. But I think she's going to be fine. The formal proceedings took most of the afternoon. Vorath Kale, whose full title I eventually learned translated roughly as first record keeper of the Vorath Sela Conclave, explained the situation, to me with the patience of someone who understood that I had been operating without context and was not to blame for it. The Vorath Sela founding line was one of the 7 conclave bloodlines that had established the earliest settled territories in this region of space. The diaspora she had described was not a minor scattering. It was a cataclysm, a period of territorial conflict that had forced the bloodline's surviving members outward across the fringe. And in the chaos of that movement, records had been lost. Hatchlings had been born to displaced pairs in unmonitored nestings. The conclave had been searching for those hatchlings, for any viable heir of the founding line, for nearly a century. The hill pair killed in the rockslide past the Keth ridgeline had not been documented in any registry Vorath Kale had been able to find. Their hatchlings should not have been findable. But the conclave had methods of tracing bloodline signatures that I was not going to understand in an Afternoon, and they had traced a signature to the Cordafel fringe, and then to the specific coordinates of Vale Station, and they had come. She has been in your care for 2 years, Vorthkale said. 2 years and 3 months, I said. She arrived as a hatchling. The clutch rejected her. The albino presentation, Vorthkale said. It was not a question. Yes, the field wardens would have allowed euthanasia. I took her instead. A pause. The old formal register returned briefly, and Vorthkale said something I did not immediately parse. Then she shifted back to the trade register. In our language, she said, there is a term for a person who keeps something alive that others have decided is not worth keeping. It is not a polite term. In its older usage, it implied someone who is keeping something that ought to have been released, interfering with a natural process. The conclave revised that usage 300 years ago. Now it means something different. What does it mean now? I said. It means, Vorthkale said, the one who kept the root alive. When everything else has been stripped away, the tree, the branches, all the leaves, and there is one thing left in the ground still holding, the person who understood what that thing was, and tended it anyway, Keth Vale. I did not say anything for a moment. I did not know what she was, I said. No, Vorthkale said. That is part of the meaning. What followed was the formal recognition. I want to describe it accurately, which means resisting the temptation to make it larger or more dramatic than it was. It was not a spectacle. Vorthkale spoke the formal words, the naming, the designation, the specific honorific that I was being given, and the 12 ancients inclined their heads again, and Vel sat at my left side and leaned her flank lightly against my leg, the way she sometimes did in the evenings when she was settling in for the night. I stood in the outer yard of my outpost, and I was named Keth Vale by a delegation of ancient dragons, and I felt, honestly, a strange quietness inside it. Not unworthiness exactly, more like the specific feeling of being recognized for something you did not do deliberately, which has its own quality. Neither pride nor embarrassment, but something in between, a kind of humble weight, I said, in the formal draconic register. I accept the name. I do not know that I earned it. I will try to be worthy of it, Vorthkale said, in a tone that managed to be both formal and dry. That response suggests you understand it better than most who have received it. Porus, still at the building corner, made a sound that he converted quickly into a cough. The practical questions came after the ceremony. I raised them because someone had to. Vel, and I would need to use her proper name now, which was Velsella, last of the Vorthsella founding line, was a juvenile. She was not yet at the developmental stage where the conclave's formal arrangements could be properly established. She had a wing limitation that required ongoing monitoring. She had also, in 2 years of life, formed clear behavioral patterns that oriented her toward this station and its routines, and disrupting those patterns abruptly had a real cost that I was not willing to ignore. I said all of this to Vorthkale. Vorthkale listened with the patience of something that has lived a very long time. What do you propose? She said. She stays here, I said, at least for now, until she's developmentally ready for whatever the conclave's arrangements involve. I'll continue her care and monitoring. You'll want reports. I can provide those quarterly, or more frequently if the situation warrants. When she's ready to make her own choices about where she lives and how, those choices are hers to make. Not mine and not yours. A pause. That is not the arrangement the conclave anticipated, Vorthkale said. I imagine not, I said. But she came back here this morning, and she will come back tomorrow morning, and the morning after that. Not because she's confined. Because she chooses to. I'd like that to remain the case. Another pause, longer this time. Vorthkale turned her head and looked at Velsella, who was in the process of investigating the food storage rack near the enclosure gate, with the focused attention she gave to things she found interesting. The conclave, Vorthkale said slowly, has been looking for the Vorthsella root for 91 years. We had begun to believe it was gone. I understand that, I said, and you are proposing that we wait. I'm proposing that we do what's right for her, I said, which is what I have been doing for 2 years and 3 months, and which seems to have produced an outcome you are satisfied with. The dry quality returned to Vorthkale's tone, but there was something underneath it now that I would later learn to recognize as the nearest thing she had to warmth. Keth Vale, she said, the one who kept the root alive. Yes, I said. We will accept your proposal. They stayed through the afternoon and into the early evening, and it was not a tense staying. It was more like the careful process of two parties learning how to exist in the same space. Vorthkale was methodical, which I respected. She asked detailed questions about Velsella's development, her wing status, her behavioral patterns, the specific details of her care. I answered all of them. I showed her the records, which were thorough because I keep thorough records, regardless of the species or the circumstances, and she read them with an attention that suggested she was storing everything she saw. The other 11 ancients ranged more freely once the formal proceedings were complete. 2 of them found their way to the exercise yard and spent time watching Valsella move across it, with the specific quality of attention that I had begun to recognize as something between reverence and relief. One of them, a copper-scaled ancient with patterns of wear along her ridge that suggested extreme age, sat near the yard's eastern wall and did not move for most of the afternoon, simply watching. Valsella moved through all of this with the equanimity that was her characteristic. She was curious about the ancients. She investigated them carefully, the same focused attention she gave to the food rack or a new piece of equipment in the enclosure, but she was not overwhelmed by them. She tolerated their proximity. She occasionally leaned against one or another of them briefly, the same flank contact she used with me, and each time she did, the ancient in question went still with a quality that I can only describe as something being restored. As the light fell toward evening, Vorath Kale came to stand beside me at the yard gate. "She is well," she said. It was not framed as a question, but it had the weight of one. "She is," I said. "The wing is permanent. She will always have a slight limitation on her left side extension. It does not seem to trouble her. She compensates well. Will it affect her in ways that matter? I don't know. That's an honest answer. I know the physical parameters. What those mean for her long term, in the context of what she is and what the Conclave expects for her, that's outside my expertise, and I won't pretend otherwise." Vorath Kale nodded. The gesture was not a dragon gesture. She had adopted it for my benefit, I suspected, the way the very old sometimes collect the communication habits of the people they have dealt with over long years. 2 years and 3 months, she said. Alone at a station on the fringe. Not alone, I said. I have an assistant and her. Before her, I said. I had the work. The work is enough. She looked at me with those ancient eyes, which held the kind of depth that accumulates when a consciousness has been running for centuries. She was trying to understand something about me, I thought, trying to fit me into a category that might not quite exist in her catalog of human types. Most people, she said finally, would have followed the recommendation, the euthanasia recommendation. Most people, I said, don't take in every animal that comes through. I don't either. It was not a principled decision. She was in front of me and I looked at her and I thought, not yet. That was it. Not yet. And after was just the work, I said. The same work I do for any animal in my care. Another long pause. Keth Vale, she said. And this time it was not a ceremony. It was just a word, said quietly. The one who kept the root alive. I did not respond to it. I watched Valsella cross the yard in the last of the evening light, white against the gray of the packed earth, unhurried, not asking for anything. The 12 left as night settled in, lifting from the outer yard in the same formation they had arrived in. Vorath Kale had exchanged contact protocols with me, formal conclave channels, encoded and secure, the kind of communication infrastructure that I had never had cause to use before, and would now apparently be maintaining. She had confirmed the quarterly report arrangement. She had confirmed the agreement. Valsella remained at Vale Station under my care for as long as that arrangement served her development, and when she was ready to make her own choices, she would make them. Before she went, Vorath Kale had said one more thing. The conclave will not be absent, she said. We will want to visit, to know her, to be known to her. That is important for what she is. That seems right, I said. I'll make arrangements for the landings. The station will be recognized, she said, formally through our registry, as a place of significance. That designation has practical effects, certain protections, certain resource provisions. I will send you the documentation. I started. The station, Vorath Kale said, with a finality that I recognized as the close of a topic, will be recognized. I did not argue further. They went up into the dark in formation, and I stood in the outer yard and watched until I could no longer see them. And then I stood a little while longer, because I was not quite ready to go inside. Valsella came and stood beside me. She put her flank lightly against my leg, which was the thing she did. After a moment I put my hand on her neck, briefly, the professional gesture of contact that I used with animals in my care, when contact was appropriate and welcome. Then I took my hand back and turned toward the main building. Come on, I said. It's late. You should eat. She followed me inside. Porus was waiting in the main hall with the expression of a man who had experienced a considerable amount in one afternoon, and had many questions and was not sure which to ask first. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," I said. What does this mean? For the station? For her?" "For her," I said. "It means she has a history, which she always did but didn't know yet, and a family of sorts, eventually, when she's ready. For the station, it means we're going to need to expand the outer yard to accommodate larger visitors." I thought for a moment. "And we should probably improve the landing approach communication. I don't want 12 of them coming in unannounced again." Porus looked at me. "And for you?" I considered the question. "I have a new name," I said. "I'm not sure what to do with it yet." I went through to the back office and sat down at my desk and pulled up Velsella's records on the station terminal. I opened her development log and entered the date and the day's events, the delegation arrival, the formal identification, the agreed arrangement, the conclave designation. I wrote it the same way I wrote every other entry: precise, clinical, factual, without editorial inflation. An extraordinary event, recorded in ordinary language, because that was how records should be kept. I noted the wing assessment from 2 weeks prior, which still showed the residual stiffness at the same measurement it had shown for the past 6 months. Stable, not improving, not worsening. I flagged it for the next quarterly review, which would now go to the conclave as well. Then I leaned back in the chair and looked at the window, which gave a view of the exercise yard. Velsella had settled on the flat-top boulder she preferred, the one that caught the late heat from the building's exterior wall after the sun had gone down. She was white in the darkness, visible even without the yard lights on, and she was sitting with her head slightly tilted in her listening posture, though there was nothing specific to listen to. Just the night sounds of the station, the cooling metal of the roof, the distant movement of the other animals in the recovery ward. There was something that came back to me then, sitting in the chair in the back office with the record still open on the terminal. A specific afternoon, perhaps 8 months after she had arrived, when I had been doing a routine assessment and had noticed for the first time that she was watching my hands. Not in the way animals watch a hand that is coming toward them, with the evaluative attention that measures whether what is coming is a threat or a reward. She was watching with what I could only call interest. Her head was steady, her eyes tracking the specific movements of the examination, and when I paused between stages of the assessment to make a note, she waited, and when I resumed, her attention resumed. I had considered, in those months, whether I was doing her a disservice by keeping her at the station, rather than pushing harder toward release. It was the kind of question that did not have a clean answer, and I did not want to construct an answer from the fact that I found her presence useful, because that was not a valid clinical consideration. So I turned it over honestly. A dragon with her wing profile, in a wild territory past the ridgeline, would face specific challenges. The albino coloring was the larger problem. It made her visible to things that should not be able to find her easily, and in the territories past the Cordafel settlements, there were sufficient predatory pressures that visibility was a real liability. Her compensation pattern, which I had watched her develop in the exercise yard, was excellent on the ground, but did not translate directly to the kind of sustained flight, agility she would need in contested airspace. These were not insurmountable problems, but they were real ones. The counterargument was that long-term station residence carried its own costs, dependency patterns, reduced exposure to environmental complexity, the particular softness that settled into animals who did not have to work for what they needed. I was attentive to these. I varied the feeding arrangements periodically, introduced complexity into her enclosure routines, brought in novel objects and situations when I could. She adapted to all of it readily, which was a good sign, but readiness for novelty inside a managed environment was not the same as readiness for the genuine uncertainty of the outer territories. I had not resolved the question by the time the delegation arrived. That is the honest answer. I was still holding it, still turning it, still not sure which side had the better of the argument, and in the end, the delegation arrived before I had made the decision, and the decision became irrelevant, because the question of where Velsela belonged turned out to have an answer that I had not known to consider. I had said, "You're watching what I'm doing." She had made a sound in the lower register, the affirming resonance. "You want to know what I'm looking for." The same sound, so I had explained it. The rib structure and what the spacing told me about respiratory function. The scale edges and what their condition indicated about nutrition. The wing joints, the specific measurement I was taking, and what the number meant, and how it compared to the previous measurement 2 weeks prior. She had listened to all of it, and when I was done with the assessment, she had done something I had not expected. She had turned her head and indicated the chart I was writing in with a deliberate look. "You want to see the record," I said. The affirming resonance again. I had shown her the chart, held it so she could read the numbers and the notation I used for the various measurements. She had studied it for a longer time than I expected, and then she had looked at me, and in her eyes, in the quality of the attention there, was something that I did not have good language for at the time. Recognition, perhaps. The beginning of understanding that the careful, repetitive work I was doing was not arbitrary, that it had a shape, that it accumulated into something. I had thought about that afternoon many times since, and sitting in the back office with the record open, and the evening settling around the station, I thought about it again. She had not been simply a patient in my care. She had been paying attention, learning, not because I had taught her or set out to, but because that was the kind of creature she was, one that watched carefully and tried to understand the shape of things. The founding line of the Vorath Sella conclave, the last heir of a 91-year search. Small and albino and rejected by her clutch and trembling in a carry case on a Tuesday when the feed delivery was late. I had looked at her and thought, not yet, the rest was just the work. I had kept thorough records for 11 years. The record I wrote that evening was no different from any other. Precise, clinical, factual. But when I reached the line for the conclave's formal designation of the station, I paused for a moment before writing it in. Place of significance. That was the phrase Vorath Kale had used. The documentation would use formal conclave language, which I did not yet have, but the working entry in Velsella's record would use the phrase as given. Place of significance. It was a large phrase for a station that had been running for 11 years, on an outer fringe that most of the core territories did not think about much. A station with one full-time staff member, one assistant with a periodically bad shoulder, outdated pressure sensors on the landing approach, and a supply manifests that never quite matched the inventory. A station that had been, for most of its life, the last viable option for animals that other facilities did not have room for. I wrote the phrase in. Then I saved the record and closed the terminal. I had records to write. Quarterly review coming up. The outer yard expansion to plan. A communication protocol to establish with an ancient conclave I had not known existed until yesterday. I went to lock up for the night. In the yard, I stopped as I always stopped, and looked up at the ridge above the main building where Velsella usually roosted after her evening settling. She was not on the ridge tonight. She was still on the boulder in the yard, still sitting, still in the posture of something that has decided where it is going to be. I stood there for a moment in the dark, this woman with a new name she was not sure she had earned, in the yard of a station she had been running for 11 years, looking at a small white dragon who had come to her on a Tuesday when the feed delivery was late and had stayed. Then I went inside and finished locking up, and turned off the lights one by one down the corridor, and went to bed. In the morning, she was on the ridge again. I stood in the yard in the early light and looked up at her, white against the sky, and she looked back down at me with those large, steady eyes that had been watching me since she was too small to refuse the attention. I had reports to write, quarterly review coming up, the outer yard expansion to plan, a communication protocol to establish with an ancient conclave I had not known existed until yesterday. I went inside and started the day,